So I'm repairing a batch of these Olympus Trip 35s. These two are ones that are done, and we also have several that are not so done. And there's one little feature about these, which is it's not quite unique. There's other cameras that do this, but it's still surprising, especially to us today. And that's that this is a camera with automatic exposure and no batteries. There's no batteries or anything like that in this, but it has a light meter and can determine the correct shutter speed and aperture just from the light and nothing else. And seeing as though we've got a bunch of these in pieces, great opportunity to talk about and demonstrate how these work. This camera can expose the film correctly by adjusting the opening of the aperture. So you can see as I'm pressing the shutter release, the aperture is going from a little pinhole, which is its resting position, to opening, in this case, very open. And the reason that's very open, despite me shining a light into it, is because I'm telling the camera through this ring that the sensitivity of the film is 25 ISO. If I set that up to 400, we see a much smaller opening. If I shine light more intensely, we can see that it barely opens from its resting position at all. Controlling the aperture isn't the only thing this camera can do to adjust its exposure. It also has the choice of a shutter speed of 1/40th of a second or 1/200th of a second, both of which are pretty much fine for handheld shooting with this camera. But yeah, it has kind of two levers to pull, but it has the most fine tuning on the aperture. But how does it do this without batteries or a computer? Here the shutter hasn't been wound, so I haven't operated the film advance to wind the shutter. But still, when you press the shutter release, the aperture opens, and that intrinsically, the force that I put into the shutter release is what physically opens the aperture. And the aperture will open as far as it can go. It will go until something stops it. Okay, that's strange. Then what is going to stop it? How is that aperture going to be set? And well, let me show you. If I take this light and shine it into the lens, can you see that needle moving just here as I move the light backwards and forwards? When I press the shutter release, we can see this mechanism rising up, these little leaves with notches that are touching the needle and thus influencing how far that moves. Now if I give it more light, it moves slightly to the right. It impacts at a higher point. That really represents its response curve, if you like. But you can see it's in like two stages. So if I go a bit brighter, like here, it's right at the bottom of that other stage. Because it's lower, that actually means the aperture is going to remain more closed. The higher up it is on that little curve, the more the blades are going to open. So why does it drop down? Well, that is because that is the point at which it switches from 1/40th to 1/200th. So this simultaneously sets the shutter speed and aperture. This is a mechanical computer. It's calibrated to take inputs of the lights and the sensitivity setting from the ring, and based on the literal physical characteristics, it's going to set the correct aperture and shutter speed. All of that is mechanical, but that still doesn't explain how the needle works. Why does the needle move in the first place? How does it actually sense the lights? Well, the answer, surprisingly, is actually electricity. It doesn't have a battery, but that needle is moved electrically. It's a little servo that lives in here, and it gets its power from the light sensor. This ring is a selenium light cell, not so dissimilar from what you'd find in a calculator. And depending on how much light hits this sensor, which surrounds the lens, it will generate a different voltage depending on how bright it is, which will move that needle by the appropriate amount. It's, if you like, a passive sensor. It would be like having a voltmeter that draws its power from what it's measuring. All this has to do is generate enough electricity to operate that servo. And the more voltage there is, the further that needle moves, just like if it was a gauge. So inside a Trip 35 is a little mechanical computer that takes the input of lights hitting the sensor and the input you set for the film sensitivity on this ring, and from that it calculates the optimal shutter speed and aperture value, powered only by the force of you doing this and the very light it's measuring, which makes this a very reliable little system and way too clever for its own goods. It's clever in a very, very dumb way. Therefore, I very much like this camera.
A lot of people might say I'm stupid. I don't know. I don't think I am. Like, I'm probably smarter than that. I mean, this thing here is smarter than me, I guess, but it has a battery.
I hope you found that kind of interesting, and hopefully you might see some of what I enjoy about playing around with old cameras and old technology in general. Apart from the fact it's very clicky-clacky and tactile, there's so much evidence here of problems that engineers have had to solve in the past that we may not have even considered today, and see some of the creative solutions they come up with on how to solve them despite those limitations. And I think in some cases there's a lot we can learn today, both in technical implementation but mostly in principle. And maybe it's worth reintroducing some of these limitations and problems, because the fact that this doesn't need a battery makes a camera from the 70s still reliable today, still sought after today. Meanwhile, we live in a world where you can't scan an image on your scanner because you're out of magenta ink.